Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimas.
And I'm Daniel Almaguer.
And this is our Easter episode. Happy Easter.
Yes, happy Easter. Happy Resurrection Sunday.
Yep.
It's always fun.
Yep. Big plans?
Yeah, gonna go to spend some time with family. My dad always, he's a killer on that barbecue.
Nice.
Gets his New Balance shoes on and it's game over.
He's dadding hard.
He's dadding hard, exactly.
Nice. I love it. Well, I'm probably going to stuff myself with like potato salad or whatever.
Oh, definitely.
I don't know. Sounds like my jam. Anyway, we have an Easter-themed show for you today.
First up is Culture Talk. Sandra will be discussing the power of the resurrection with philosopher George Haraksin.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with George Haraksin. George, thank you so much for joining us.
Always fun to be here.
You know, we've got this Easter episode that we're going to be talking about, what is Easter about? It's about the resurrection. So we're going to be talking about the resurrection. And, I like to always provide like a skeptic's perspective and some questions that they might be asking. So when we think about the resurrection, a skeptic might wonder, why did Jesus show up so meekly? If he is the Son of God, why would he show up so meekly and allow himself to be crucified?
Well, that's a good question, not just for skeptics, but I think a Christian reading the text will encounter that as well. And especially post-resurrection, Jesus shows up in the ordinary places, right? He's in the garden, he does breakfast by the beach, he doesn't immediately overwhelm people. And that, in one way, shouldn't surprise us. How did Jesus come to earth? Well, he was born in a manger. Yes, there's some fanfare there, but it seems like after the resurrection, he wants to take some time. He knows how much to disclose and how little. So in one way, you could say that Jesus hides so we can see, and we see this on the road to Emmaus, where he does a very long, might have been a very long Bible study with the people on the road there who were downcast and dispirited, weren't understanding what was happening. So Jesus knows how to approach people so he doesn't overwhelm them, yet at the same time, we do find other instances, like when he shows up to Paul in Acts, where it's much more bolder.
Right. So then the reasoning behind that is that, like, maybe he, like you said, he's hiding so that we can see, so that we've got to do some investigating, maybe?
Yeah, we're learning to ask the right questions. I think Jesus is wanting people to own their belief, their understanding, their commitment to him. Even if you look back into the Old Testament, you look back into Genesis, what does God do after Adam and Eve sin? Well, he doesn't go in and scold them like a parent right away. He goes in and he asks a question. And it's amazing that God will sort of stoop down to ask us questions, to get us to think, to probe, so that we come to understand something if we are willing to.
Well, that's a really good point. And I like that, just that example that you give of the Garden of Eden. And that is probably a more effective way to kind of ask people questions in the midst of their...
I do it as a parent.
Yes, it's true. Well, I really like the example that you gave in the Garden of Eden and just really showing the effectiveness of kind of asking the question.
Yeah, we do it as parents.
Right.
I mean, in the appropriate context.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when we think about the resurrection today, like, how is it relevant for us today?
Yeah, I think it's relevant in a couple ways, not just for the Christian, but for the skeptic, as you pointed out. I remember one atheist saying that she said, honestly, as an atheist, if there is no God, then there's no life after death, arguably, then there is no ultimate hope and there is no ultimate justice. Things don't get resolved. They sort of end in the grave. And I appreciated her honesty when it came to that. For the Christian who has an understanding and can lean on the historical veracity of the resurrection, number one, there's resurrection hope, right? There's hope that justice will still be served even after death. There's hope for meeting other family members, for life to continue, for the good that we like here to continue on, and for the evil to be stamped out. So there's resurrection and hope, but that leads to a resurrection, what I would say, a comfort or peace. When I remember Gary Habermas talking about losing his wife. He's one of the most foremost experts on the historicity of the resurrection. And when he lost his wife to stomach cancer, And I think he had like 4 kids too that he had to watch go through that. He just said it was heart-wrenching. But he could truly lean on the reality of the resurrection and the hope that it brings, which then brought him peace and comfort, even in the midst of all of the pain that he was feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we can lean on. There's a hope there, there's a peace there, there's a comfort. It doesn't solve everything right in this instance, but it can bring comfort, pain, and strength for us to continue.
Right. Well, I've heard you talk about now the hope and the comfort, but I've also heard you mention that there's power in the resurrection. So can you explain that?
Yeah, I would put it, in one sense, I kind of put it this way. There's sort of this historical power that we lean on something that really happened that has effects for us today. And you might say, well, what effects does it have today? We just talked about that in the moment. We have a hope and a future to look forward to. But also, Jesus promised in the midst of that, after his resurrection, that he would give us power, and that power comes through the Holy Spirit, or the advocate, as it says in John, Gospel of John. And I think this is what distinguishes Christianity from other religions. I was a world religions major in college. Lots of religions or philosophies can tell you what to do, give you some instruction on where to do it, but does it give you power to do it? And part of Christ's claim is that he's alive and he can partner with God the Holy Spirit to actually help us become good people. So we lean on a historical set of circumstances that gives us power. There is the personal presence of God that gives us power, and I think it gives us evangelistic power in that. Would our life be, I like to ask this question, would our life or would your life be better off if you believed and knew the things Jesus did? Right? Then the question is, well, what did he know and what did he believe? Well, he knew that there was life after life. He knew that there was power available to be a good person. He understood reality more than we understand reality. And if you can take on those beliefs, that worldview, would your life be better? And I would argue, yes, it would. So there's evangelistic power. I'd want people to know how smart Jesus is, how wise he is, but that he's also the Son of God.
Yeah, well, you've certainly given a lot of information about the resurrection and how it not only brings us redemption and hope and strength and comfort, but also power to be transformed.
Yeah, power to forgive others. But I mean, so many things we could talk about with that.
Well, thank you so much for that, George. Plenty to unpack still on this topic. If you would like to hear more from George, visit reasons.org and search for George Haraksin.
The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, without question, is central to the Christian faith. So it's very important as Christian apologists that we know how to make a historical case that Jesus lived, that he died on the cross, that he was buried, and that he was raised from the dead. And we've been talking about 10 facts that even non-believers who are New Testament scholars will agree upon that clearly establish that Jesus lived, that he died on the cross, that he was buried. But then how do we get from that to Jesus rose from the dead? Because I don't believe that these critical New Testament scholars would grant the historicity of the resurrection.
Exactly. Those of us who affirm the historical argument for the resurrection, we are in the majority. We fit very comfortably with the mainstream of New Testament scholarship when it comes to these 10 facts we've been talking about. But unfortunately, we're in the minority when it comes to our hypothesis as to what the best explanation for these 10 facts are or is. And therefore, we have to make a very strong case to convince the not already convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. As an aside, I would say this. Most Christians who hear that the majority of critics accept these 10 facts are very emboldened in their faith. And as Anthony Flew, who was once an atheist, and he was an atheist actually when he said these words, he eventually became a theist, he said, these kinds of facts that we're talking about make it very reasonable for the Christian to maintain his belief in the resurrection. So for the people watching our discussion and have been watching this series, I think that those who are already convinced that Jesus rose from the dead should have their faith emboldened by what we've been talking about over these past couple of episodes. But how do we move the not already convinced from these 10 facts are true to Jesus rose from the dead? And typically what the great defenders of the resurrection of our day are doing, people like Gary Habermas and Michael Licona, people like William Lane Craig and N.T. Wright, what they're doing is they're taking a two-pronged approach to get you to affirm the resurrection. And the approach is very simple. The first point is that there are no plausible naturalistic hypotheses that have ever been given to adequately explain the facts of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the life-changing faith of the disciples. And this is actually something, interestingly enough, that is also granted by the majority of scholars. Most scholars don't think that the idea that the disciples stole the body is a plausible explanation of the empty tomb. Why? Because it would contradict the fact of their sincere faith. Most scholars don't think that the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but was buried alive and then somehow made his way out of the tomb, is a plausible explanation of the empty tomb. Because it would be very hard for a man in Jesus' condition to, if that hypothesis were true, to convince the disciples that he's the Lord of glory. I mean, this is a man that needs medical attention, not worship. So those kinds of theories to explain the empty tomb are out. Most scholars are comfortable saying these naturalistic hypotheses are not really good. Also, explanations of the appearance is really reduced to one explanation, and that is the idea that the disciples experienced hallucinations of Jesus after he had been crucified. There are many problems with the hallucination hypothesis. One is that we have no case examples of anybody or any group of people experiencing the same hallucination. Study after study after study have shown that hallucinations are an individual affair. They aren't experienced by groups. And yet the evidence that we've been looking at suggests that the appearances of Jesus appeared to groups of people under different occasions and during various circumstances. So it doesn't fit hallucination well. But even if you were able to get around that point, the hallucination hypothesis would not explain how Paul would experience an appearance of Jesus. If Peter, for example, experienced an hallucination and was able to somehow convince the disciples that the hallucination is veridical or authentic, it's hard to explain why that experience among the disciples would have spilled over into the psyche of Paul. And so Paul remains a very important fact standing in the way of any plausible hallucination hypothesis. And then the fact of the sincere faith of the disciples. Interestingly enough, the fact of the sincere faith of the disciples is itself something that can't be explained naturalistically. Some scholars have said, well, the disciples borrowed from pagan religions and stories of gods and goddesses rising from the dead, and they borrowed from them, and that's how they came up with their doctrine of resurrection. But if you study those pagan so-called parallels closely, you'll notice that, first of all, they're not parallels at all, and most of them are stories that came after the founding of Christianity. A favorite example that some Christ mythicists use to sort of draw a parallel between pagan literature and early Christianity would be the life and death of Apollonius of Tyana. But Apollonius of Tyana, if he did live at all, lived some 40 or 50 years after Jesus died. And our earliest source describing his death comes about 150 years later. So Apollonius of Tyana does not give us a really good parallel between Jesus and these pagan heroes. Most scholars believe that Jesus is to be interpreted in a Jewish context, and as such, the resurrection has to be understood as a Jewish phenomenon. Now, some scholars have said, well, that means the disciples tapped into their Jewish tradition and sort of made up the story of the resurrection. But what's interesting about that is that in Judaism, especially the Judaism of the first century, Jews had no concept of a dying and rising Messiah. And the Jewish conception of resurrection was a conception where the resurrection would happen at the end of human history, and it would happen to a whole bunch of people. So if you take a passage like Daniel chapter 12, where you have at the end of the world, people were being raised from the dead to life and to death, and eternal life and eternal death. You don't have that happening with Jesus. Jesus' resurrection is dissimilar from Judaism in two fundamental respects. It was the resurrection of one man in the middle of human history. This, by the way, explains Thomas's doubt in John chapter 20. Some people interpret Thomas as an ancient David Hume who didn't believe in miracles or something. Thomas is not that at all. Thomas is a Jew who's been following Jesus around, seeing all these extraordinary things he's doing. He's not a man who disbelieves in miracles. So what is Thomas saying when he says, unless I stick my finger in his side and look at the scars on his hand, unless I see this, I'm not going to believe that Jesus had risen? This resurrection of Jesus has contradicted his categories. Thomas is thinking, when Jesus is raised, it will be at the end of human history, and I will be raised with him. And since I have not experienced the resurrection, clearly Jesus hasn't experienced the resurrection. Jesus is blowing everybody's categories, in other words, when he's rising from the dead. And so it's very, very hard to understand how these uneducated disciples would have had the theological savvy to conjure up a doctrine of the resurrection. And what's even more interesting is that Judaism offered several rich venues for them to go to explain what happened to Jesus. Assuming that they could have gotten past the crucifixion and still maintain their belief that Jesus is the Messiah, there's several theories they could have put out there for people to consider and maintain their belief that Jesus was the Christ. For example, they could have said that Jesus' body was, after his death, assumed up into heaven like Elijah's and is there awaiting the resurrection. And he will come again, and for those of you that don't believe, you know, you might be in trouble. Or they could say that they experienced Jesus alive again through a vision, say in Abraham's bosom or something like that. So since Judaism provided all of these rich venues for them to explore, to explain what happened to Jesus, why abandon those and opt for resurrection? It doesn't really make sense, especially since they didn't really have the theological savvy to do this. So these naturalistic hypotheses do not explain the facts very well at all. On the other hand, apologists for the resurrection have turned around and made a positive case for the resurrection by pointing out that there are several criteria that, when applied to the resurrection, make the resurrection very plausible. And I'll give you two. The resurrection has greater explanatory scope than all of the other naturalistic theories. The hallucination hypothesis does not explain the appearances, for example, as I just said. But even if it did, it wouldn't explain the empty tomb. For that, you would have to come up with another theory. And even if the disciples had hallucinated Jesus, that wouldn't guarantee that they would have hallucinated him and come to the conclusion that he had risen from the dead. As I said before, their own faith tradition provided avenues for them to explore, to explain what happened to Jesus. So the hallucination does not explain their sincere faith in Jesus' resurrection, nor does an hallucination explain the empty tomb. So the naturalist, if he is going to opt for a naturalistic theory, is bound to a combinational hypothesis that's very implausible. The resurrection, on the other hand, is one simple idea that, in the words of Michael O'Connor, explains all the facts without strain, and that is explanatory scope. The resurrection hypothesis also has greater explanatory power than the other hypotheses. For example, you'll notice that these naturalistic hypotheses will say things like the disciples stole the body. Well, that contradicts an established fact that they had a sincere faith in Jesus' resurrection. On the other hand, the resurrection hypothesis actually explains these facts and actually increases your confidence in them. The very fact that they had a sincere faith is bolstered by the fact of the resurrection. So these facts actually become more plausible once you bring the resurrection into the mix, and that is explanatory power. And so for these and other reasons, while I am in the minority, and people like William Lane Craig and Michael O'Connor and Gary Habermas, they too are in the minority of scholars when we affirm the resurrection. I think that even though I am in the minority here, I think there are really good reasons to think that Jesus really did rise from the dead.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink. Welcome to Science Faith Connection, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific ideas and see how they connect to the truth of the Christian faith. I'm joined again by my colleague and friend, Ken Samples, and we're going to look at evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Ken, good to have you here today.
Hi, Jeff.
Both you and I are Christians, so we think Christianity is actually true. And one of the cornerstone building blocks of Christianity is that Jesus the second person of the Godhead came, lived on earth, died, and rose from the grave. That's a key fundamental feature of Christianity. So one of the questions that just kind of naturally arises in that is, how do we know the resurrection is true? I mean, we can't go back and do any tests or experiments to see whether it happened. So what confidence can we have that it actually happened?
Well, I think we can look at history. We can look at testimony. Let me mention a half a dozen things briefly that all New Testament scholars accept. So these are not just Christian scholars. These would be skeptical scholars. Maybe they're atheists, maybe they're agnostic, maybe they're theologically liberal. What are those handful? Gary Habermas, a specialist on the resurrection, he calls them minimal facts, meaning these are the things that every scholar principally accepts. The first one would be that Jesus was crucified, that he died publicly. Okay. I don't know anybody who questions that issue of Jesus' death, public crucifixion by the Romans. So we know he was dead.
So just as a quick little detour on that, I've had people challenge me that we don't even know whether Jesus was a person or not. So if the idea that Jesus was publicly crucified, that would seem to say that there's basically the scholarship out there says, yeah, Jesus was actually a person that lived.
Yeah,
am I correct?
I know very few scholars. I mean, the idea of a Christ myth, Jesus mythology, that is a minority position, and if it were accepted to be true, then I don't know what you would do with the classical departments in our major universities. We couldn't know anything about Plato, Aristotle, anybody in the ancient world.
Okay.
Very few people question that, and none of the New Testament scholars question that Jesus died a public death, that he was crucified by the Romans. Now, a second assumption that is accepted is that some of his followers began to experience what we might call appearances.
Okay.
That they were seeing things. Not only was the tomb empty, but I don't want to talk about that. Some of Jesus' followers started seeing what they thought was the person of Jesus.
Okay.
And this then moves to the third point that is accepted, and that is that these appearances, these apparent resurrection appearances of Jesus, they had a transforming effect on the people who saw them. They moved, for example, from being fearful and anxious and defeated cowards, if you will, to being people who are willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to suffer martyrdom because I've seen Jesus resurrected from the dead. Now, the skeptical scholars don't believe those appearances were actually real, but they don't discount that they were having some kind of experience and it transformed their character.
So that's kind of, so you got Jesus was a public death that people claimed to have seen him afterwards, and that it transformed their character. So these are presumably pieces of evidence that any good explanation has to account for.
Number 4, that all of this was very early. That is the crucifixion, the appearances, the transformation of the apostles all happened in a very close proximity of time. So it wasn't, dozens of years. Things like this were transpiring within weeks, within months. So all of this is early testimony, okay? Now, then we move a little bit further. There's particularly 2 people who are not predisposed to the resurrection. They were opposed. One would be James, the half-brother of Jesus, if you will. I mean, imagine growing up in Jesus' family. Why can't you be more like Jesus? But James thought Jesus was mentally ill, because only mentally ill people claim to be Yahweh, claim to be the great I am. But James saw the resurrected Jesus, and it totally transformed him from thinking his brother was mentally ill to thinking his brother was, in fact, the Son of God. And then the last one would be Paul. He is not predisposed to becoming a Christian. He is anti-Christian. He could be perceived as being a jihadist, if you will. He wanted to arrest Christians. He thought this is a cult. These people ought to be killed if they won't repent. What happens? He sees the resurrected Jesus in his testimony, and it totally transforms him. So those are the 6 minimal facts
Okay.
that everybody accepts. Now, again, I'm not saying that the agnostic, atheist, liberal scholars accept the Christian interpretation of those facts, but they agree, yep, Christ was crucified. Yes, it appears that his disciples had genuine appearances. There is evidence of transformation, and this all happened in a very early context. And James and Paul had no reason to accept this other than for the claims they made. That's a lot of assumptions to accept, and they are accepted by critical scholars as well.
So it sounds like there are certain explanations or certain ways of accounting or dealing with Christianity, if you're skeptical of it, that we can just kind of outright reject because they don't line up with the facts. So, for example, Jesus didn't actually exist. That just doesn't seem to accord with the scholarship, or
Yes.
the fact that Jesus wasn't crucified,
Yes.
or that Paul wasn't radically, so things that don't account for those facts, we can just kind of outright reject because that just seems poor scholarship. But it does seem like there are even within that, there are explanations that account for those that say the resurrection didn't happen. As a scientist, one of the things you do is you say, all right, how can we continue to test this and find this explanation is better than the other? How do we go, can we apply a scientific approach to analyzing that and get closer to the truth of what actually happened?
Well, I think you can, in the sense that you can use kind of an abductive approach, that is, what is the best explanation. So it's true, Jeff, that these critical scholars, they look at these appearances and they say, well, they weren't really seeing Jesus. Maybe they were having some kind of religious visions or religious experience, but it really wasn't authentic. I guess maybe they could say maybe they're having some kind of psychological experience that wasn't based in reality. Or they may say that maybe the transformation, I don't know what they would say about James and Paul. The transformation is so profound. But now the question is, well, is there any alternative explanation? Is there alternative theories that we can accept? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think the evidence for the resurrection is so powerful, is all the alternative explanations I've seen seem so inadequate to be able to really explain these kinds of things. I don't know how you would explain authentically the transformation of James and Paul. I mean, they were not predisposed to believe. James thought his brother was mentally ill. Paul thought these were heretics. And yet they had some kind of visionary experience that transformed their lives. So name whatever alternative explanation you want. I think that those are all really rather inadequate or shallow.
Well, thanks, Ken. I appreciate your comments. When we look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, it seems like there is quite an abundance of evidence for that. And it really does point to Christianity's, that Jesus actually rose from the dead is the best explanation for all of those facts. Ken listed, 6 of them, but I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out his blog, 12 evidences for the resurrection of Jesus, to get more evidence that supports that Jesus actually rose from the dead, so that we can go out and tell people how they can have a relationship with God through Jesus.
We hope that this episode has helped equip you to share your faith with compassion and confidence.
And you know what? I think we learned a lot about the resurrection and really how to have conversations with people, particularly if they're not sure if the resurrection actually happened.
Right. Absolutely, because this is always a really big talking point with a skeptic. Right. They're always very skeptical on, how could someone come back to life? How can Jesus really be risen from the dead?
Right. Yeah, and if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then our faith is for nothing.
Kaput.
Yes. So lots to learn there. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget, subscribe to the show, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
And if you would like to listen to the audio version of the show, you can find us on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
We'll see you next week.
See ya.